Hello, my name is Rick. I'm one of the support engineers here at Storix, and I'd like to welcome you to another Storix software training session. Today we're going to be talking about configuring USB and other local types of disks for backup and recovery. With the price of large USB drives, those drives 2 terabytes and above, now falling below $100 a piece, these types of devices have become a really viable alternative to tape backup. They can be rotated just like you would rotate tapes, and in most cases they're more easily configurable as an alternative boot device. In this training we're going to discuss how to configure and manage locally connected USB drives and internal disk drives for backup as well as system recovery. So first off, let's talk about a local internal backup disk. Why would you want to be running your backups to a local disk? First off, they're very inexpensive. You can now get an extra IDE or SATA drive, and one of the biggest advantages of having your backups locally on an internal disk is that you don't need the network. So if your network goes down or you have some sort of DR situation, you can very easily get to the backups. Also, with the backup being on the disk, it means that you can run the backups usually faster and thus more frequently. So it wouldn't be unthinkable to be running an hourly backup. A lot of times people ask us, well, if I'm just going to be backing up to a local hard disk that I have in the machine, why not just configure it for RAID? Well, RAID is a great option if you want to guarantee availability in case one of your disks goes bad. However, if you fat finger something and accidentally erase all of Etsy, RAID isn't going to do you any good because that error would have gotten duplicated onto all of the other drives in your array. Finally, one of the best features in using a local internal backup disk is just like your main hard disk, it's bootable. So your boot media and your backup are together in one place. You don't have to find a recovery CD in order to recover your system. You would just reboot the system and within the BIOS select to boot from the other disk. You'll get the Storix recovery menu and you can restore files or the entire system from there. Now, the other type of local device that we're going to be talking about is USB. And as I said earlier, one of the biggest advantages of USB is that it's cheap. And because it's so cheap, this will allow you very easily to grab even a thumb drive for many systems and use it for offsite rotation. So if you have requirements to take your data offsite, which we at Storix highly recommend, this is a great way of doing it. And in fact, the Storix SBadmin software will manage those USB drives for you just like it would manage tapes for you. So you can rotate them and the Storix software will keep track of where you are in your rotation strategy, which drive has which data, etc. Also, USB disks, if you're comparing those, for example, to a tape drive, USB disks are very easy to configure. On almost every system out there, you literally just plug it in and you're ready to go, whereas a tape device might need special drivers. A tape drive might work with one system and not work with another, whereas a USB drive can be transferred from one system to another very easily. So that goes to the last point. It's universal. So let's say for tape, if your tape drive goes bad, you're going to have to go find the same type of tape drive to read that tape, and if it's years down the road and this is an archived tape, that might be harder to do. USB drives, although they don't necessarily have the same tested durability as tape might have, they definitely are much more universal. You could pull up the data on almost any system to be able to access it. So in today's training, here's what we're going to do. I'm going to go ahead and add a USB device to a system and show you what that looks like, both adding it and how you would configure it for backups. And we'll go ahead and create and run a backup job to that USB device. And then I'll show you how to use multiple USB disks, so how to rotate those in and out. And I will be doing that initially with the Workstation Edition of our software because in a lot of cases that might be what you're using. Then in the second part of this training, I'm going to configure an internal drive. So in this case, it'll be like an SDB, as a local system backup disk. And for that, just to show you the differences, I will be using Network Edition for that. So I'll configure the local system backup disk, and then I'm actually going to simulate a fat fingering and show you how quickly and easily you can restore from your local system backup disk. And I will be using KVM on a VM to do that, since I wouldn't be able to do it on my local system, or I wouldn't be able to record it for you. So with that said, let's go ahead and jump into it. Now, one bit of warning here. When you configure a USB device or a local hard drive for booting and backup, in our case we call this SBDIR, that's the module that runs this. Anytime you configure an SBDIR device, the Stork software is going to wipe all of the information stored on it. That's so that it can set up the correct partitions it needs to boot and keep your backup data. So a big warning, if you want to play with this, make sure you're using drives that don't have any data on them that you need. With that said, let's go ahead and jump in. The first section of this we're going to be using the Workstation Edition of the software for, but regardless, you start the same way by typing sbadmin, and that will bring up the GUI interface. You can also do this with the web interface if that's what you're used to using. You'll notice my installation here is fairly clean. I haven't configured anything yet. I want to show you what this looks like from scratch. Also note, if you're used to using the Network Edition, configuration here will be slightly different, but you'll be using the same process that you would use in either edition, whether you're configuring an internal disk drive that's unused or a USB drive. This same facility will work for both of them. The point being that you've got some kind of dedicated disk that you want to use for nothing but Storx backups and booting, essentially for bare metal recovery. In the Workstation Edition, to configure the device properly, you'd go to Configure, Backup Devices, and then System Backup Disk /NFS. And that's going to give you a screen, hopefully, that's fairly familiar to you. And to select the disk that you want to use for the backup, you would just drop down this menu. I'm going to get an error here because I haven't plugged my USB disk in. So the software has gone through and said, I haven't found any unused disks that I can use. And it gives you the two biggest piece of advice for those disks, in that your disk must be unused and unmounted. So it's going to even give you a couple of things to check on the disk that you think you want to use. Make sure it's mounted, make sure it is not mounted, make sure it's not defined in etcfs tab. The reason being that we have set up the software so that it will automatically manage mounting and unmounting the disk for you. That way, let's say when your backup's done, you can just pull the USB disk. You don't have to worry about going through and ejecting it. We essentially automatically mount it up to do the backup and unmount it so it's ready just to be pulled as soon as the backup is finished. We wanted to make it really easy to rotate disks. Also, make sure that disk isn't part of either a logical volume group, or part of software RAID component. The one other thing that we sometimes see people have problems with, where this won't work or it intermittently works, is if the disk is going bad. One of the potential downsides of USB disks especially is that they sometimes can go bad a little more frequently than a hard disk or a tape would go. So that's one thing to be aware of if you're getting especially intermittent working, is try a different USB disk first and see if that fixes the problem. All right, with all that said, I'm going to go ahead and plug the disk in here. Now, since I'm using the Ubuntu desktop, the first thing I want to look for is to make sure that Ubuntu doesn't automatically mount it for me. This disk is empty. I actually used fdisk to wipe all the partitions, so there's nothing for Ubuntu to mount right now. But if the disk already had partitions, Ubuntu's going to automatically mount it, and then I wouldn't be able to find it here. Again, another piece of advice just to look out for. And if it does mount it, if your system does automatically mount it, you need to go in and unmount it, probably at the command prompt first, so that then the Stork software knows to look for it and knows, oh, that's unmounted, that must be what you want. So now I'll go ahead and drop this down, and it's going to tell me, okay, now I see SDB, that's empty. Again, you want to make sure that you're using the disk you think you're using. Make double, triple sure, because once we configure it, it's going to wipe this disk. So I select it, And don't worry about these buttons. These buttons are only used once the disk has already been configured. So I'm just going to hit save. If this disk had already been configured for use with the Stork software, it wouldn't show up in the drop-down, but I could hit find import and that would pull it in. Also, if I wanted to manually eject it right now, I would just hit eject disk. But I've selected my disk. All I have to do at this point is hit save, and it's going to again warn me, you're about to overwrite everything, and it will automatically configure it. So what it's doing right now is creating a boot partition and putting on all the files from the local system, basically cherry picking a miniature version of the OS to put on that boot partition. That way, if your main drive, in my case SDA, gets wiped out, I could just plug this USB drive in, go into the BIOS, tell it to boot from the USB drive, and it would be able to boot and get me to the recovery menu, and I would be able to recover from the USB drive and get everything back up and running. Alright, and now that it's done, it's gone and configured all the information I need, and it tells me it successfully configured the device. If you run into any errors, when you write into support, make sure you copy everything in here, not just whatever the error is. Oftentimes we need to see this whole set of information to figure out where things went wrong. Okay, so it's configured. I'm all done in there, and now all I need to do is create a full system backup job. So I'm going to go add job ID, we'll call this local full backup, whatever you want to call it, and then make sure that you select full system here. The sbdir functionality does not work with any of the other backup types. So for example, let's say I selected directories. You'll notice here it's going to say no devices are configured. So the facility that we're using now only works with a full system backup profile. And of course I could go through and configure any of these other options I wanted. We cover that in other trainings. I'm going to keep it simple though and just select sbdir, and it's all done. So I don't need a boot CD-ROM because the disk itself will be bootable. In this case, I could either save it or go ahead and kick off the job and it's going to start running. Now in this case, my drive is very large, so it's going to take quite a bit of time for it to finish that backup. That is essentially it for configuration though. One thing you'll probably want to do, especially if you're using a local disk like this, is make sure that you set up a retention policy. And if you don't have experience in there, in your backup configuration job, just hit View Customize, and right here it's going to tell you or ask you how long you want to retain the backups for, and you could tell it whatever your system is. Maybe you want 30 days, or you've got 3 different tapes in rotation. So go ahead and hit save. And what it will do is the software will keep track of your thumb drives, and once it's time to expire one, obviously if it's not plugged into the system it can't expire that job, but what will happen is the next time you plug that disk in, if its backup has expired, it will go ahead and expire it and then run the new backup job. So the software will keep track for you of which backups are ready to be expired. You don't have to worry about, for example, labeling the disks and keeping your own calendar of which one needs to be rotated in. Just put numbers on them and rotate them in sequence, and the Stork software will take care of it. With that said, we're going to go ahead and move on because I can't show you the restore of this system while I'm recording video to it. So I'm going to close out here, and we'll just let that job finish. One thing to note, if you when you put in the next, let's say the next USB drive, when you're just getting your rotation going, you'll need to configure each disk, each USB drive. So you'll go in and do the same thing with each USB drive. So let's say if this were finished, I would go in, go to backup devices, and I would eject the disk. And that tells the Stork software, okay, we're all done with that one for now. I could take that one up offsite, put in the next disk, and then just hit the drop down. Once you've got them all configured, essentially the Stork software will manage them. You just plug in the disk, and when the backup job is set to run, it'll run, or you can kick it off manually and it will take care of things for you. But that's what that eject disk button does. Unconfigure, on the other hand, let's say you've decided to decommission a device. That's what this unconfigure button does. You've decided, you know what, I want to use this USB drive somewhere else. Unconfigure is going to go through and erase all of the partitions on there and basically make it ready again to be used as a regular USB disk. All right, with that done, let's go ahead and switch over to the other half of things, and that is working with the Network Edition. In this case, I'm going to be using a VM that's set up in our lab, so let's go ahead and jump into that. And instead of using a USB drive, I'm going to use a virtual IDE drive on the virtual machine, so an internal drive. So let's SSH over. And again, type sbadmin to get the software running. So here's a typical system. In this case, my server and my admin are the same machine, Chatham 224. If I wanted to take a backup of Chatham 224 to a local disk, whether it's a USB disk or an internal disk, I need to add it as a client. So in the network version, it's in the client configuration where you tell it that you want that backup to go to a USB disk. If you had wanted, for example, to use a USB disk attached to one of your servers as a backup disk for other machines on the network, so not as a boot disk, just as storage, what you would do is go ahead and just at the command line mount it, or in your FS tab mount it, and then create a device over here in devices to store your backups on there. But we're talking about specifically making one of these boot disks, so pretty much by definition that's going to have to be local to that disk or to that machine, because if the machine goes down, you'll need to have that device attached to the machine to recover it. So in this case, if it's the server that I want to make the backup or make it a local boot client, I need to add it as a backup client. So we'll add Chatham 224. And then in most cases when you add a client, you ignore all this stuff down here. In this case, this should look pretty familiar. This is what we were doing over on Workstation. And we're going to go ahead and drop that down. And there's SDA. In my case, on my system here, I have a VDA and an SDA. That's just how Virt Manager ended up converting it. So I know that SDA is my backup disk there, and it's ready to go for this. So same thing, I just hit save, and it's going to go through and run the same basic configuration that we saw last time. Alright, and it looks like the configuration finished. That'll usually take a minute or two. Remember, it's doing a lot of things there. It's creating partitions, writing file systems to those partitions, and then going through and creating a custom init RAM FS and grabbing your kernel and essentially making a mini version of the operating system to boot from when you need to recover. So that's all done, and now configuration is going to be essentially exactly the same as what we did on the other side. So we'll go ahead and add a backup job, and again call this local full system. Now the difference here is under server name, you're going to select local because the disk will be local to whatever client. It will be physically connected. And if you notice in here in backup profiles, I can't select anything other than full system. And if I wanted to, I could go back in here and manage my retention. Maybe I want to run, I only want to keep my backups around because this is local, maybe 15 days, and I don't really want to fill up my disk, so I only want 2 good backups. I want to make sure I have backups there, but I don't want to fill up my disk. Basically, it's for if I fat finger a file. If I really need something for DR recovery, I'm going to keep it offsite anyway. Again, select the client, it'll be the only one, and make sure you select that SBDIR device. And the rest of this is up to you. We're going to go ahead and skip it, and I'm going to go ahead and run the job so it kicks off. And through the magic of fast forward, our backup is all finished here. So what I want to do is actually simulate doing something really, really stupid on the system. And let's say I'm working away in here and I'm not paying attention. I accidentally do something like rm minus rf etc star. Obviously that's something you'd never want to do. And now I'm going to be in big trouble if I try to reboot this machine. In fact, let's go ahead and reboot it. And actually, let's do it one worse. Let's just wipe out everything. So this would be, as I'm sure you can imagine, a very bad situation. And yeah, I can't reboot. I can't run any commands. I'm totally in trouble here. So what I would do in this case is pull open the actual virtual machine, which I just happen to have sitting over here. And of course it's in the same predicament, so it's just a different window. In fact, you can tell it can't even log out correctly. So what I'm going to do is force it off and make sure in my settings for the VM that it is set to boot to the boot menu so I can boot off that second disk. So let's go ahead and start it. Now, it was originally booting off of the Vertio disk. That's disk 2 there, and you can see instantly error 15. It's not going anywhere. So let's go ahead and one more time force it off, and I'm going to tell it to boot from that other disk. And because the disk is both a boot disk and has the backup files in one, I just boot straight from that secondary disk, and it's gonna do its normal boot routine here. If you've done a recovery with our software, you should be pretty familiar with this, but I'll go ahead and let it do its thing. And you will now come up to what we like to affectionately call the blue screen of life. You're used to the blue screen of death, and we jokingly say this is probably the only blue screen you do want to see, because this is the one that's going to get you back up and running. So installation or reinstallation of your machine is pretty simple from here. You just need to tell it what backup you want to use. In this case, it's going to be from the local disk. And we only have the one backup we made, so we'll grab that one. And that's all you need to do for configuration. Hit escape and tell it go ahead and install. And it's going to give you a warning saying that you're about to overwrite everything on that original partition, VDA, which of course we want to do because there's not much left on it. And now we'll go ahead and let the install proceed. Okay, and through the magic of fast forward, we are again done with this, so go ahead and exit out of here. And let's make sure the system's bootable. So I'm going to go back to the boot menu and this time tell it to go ahead and boot off that Vertio disk that didn't work earlier. And it looks like it has a stanza in there telling us that Storix completed the restore. All right, and it looks like we now have working system again. So we're able to get it back up and restore my fat fingering issue. And that concludes the demo portion. And that's it. I'd like to thank you for joining us today. If you haven't yet downloaded our software, you can get a free copy of it fully functional at storix.com/free trial. If you have any suggestions for future trainings you'd like to see, please submit them to us at sba@storix.com. And in case you're viewing this video from somewhere else, all of our training videos can be found at youtube.com/user/Storix software, or just go to YouTube and search for Storix and you'll be able to find us pretty easily. Once again, I'm Rick, and I'd like to thank you for joining us and hope you have a great day.